The beauty of Formula 1 car designs is that every so often designers can come up with something completely mad, all because there is a glaring hole in the rulebook, because when you write rulebooks you can't account for any possible sort of, interpretation of said rulebook. This is where Formula 1 gets really interesting. Well, when it can get interesting, that is. It's the classic, it doesn't say here I can't type of thing, which doesn't seem to happen as much these days because the FIA has people actively searching for loopholes in the rules to stop the mad scientist ideas from getting conjured up. I guess the last thing was the dual-axis steering or DAS system that Mercedes had. This could be filed under, we didn't think of that so we want it banned, or that's going to cost too much for us to copy so we want it banned, or even, we've got to alter our entire car for this to work on our car so we want it banned. Delete as appropriate. I mean, to be honest, Christian Horner went through all those options when he complained to the FIA about it, while about 20 years before, Ferrari over-engineered their second brake pedal trying to copy McLaren, so that was banned instead. It is what it is. It's just Formula 1. Also, while we're here, we might as well address something because I know it's going to come up. Today is the 30th anniversary of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, and you might be thinking, where's the video on Senna and or Ratzenberger? Well, I already covered Rowland's accident in full, and I talked about the Senna crash in the video on the FW16. And since everybody and their dog is going to be doing a video on Senna today with more info, footage, images and details than I can ever give, to be honest, from my point of view, there's going to be 0 point in competing. So I've got something a little bit different. Today I'm looking at the Lotus car, which tried to take what Williams had done about 10 years before and tried to continue in that similar vein. Well, spoiler alert, it pretty much ended up the same way. So then, Lotus. Not the OG Colin Chapman Lotus, this is Team Enstone that was once Tolman, then Benetton, then Renault, then Lotus, then Renault again, and now Alpine. At least there weren't two teams called Lotus on the grid this year like there had been, well, it was actually the previous year, wasn't it? Or the year before? I don't even remember. I mean, that was just crazy. The team had been through a decent 2013, finishing 4th in the championship ahead of McLaren, and Kimi Räikkönen had won the first round of the season in Australia. Kimi also scored another 6 podiums over the course of that season, and Roman Grosjean in the other car had picked up a smattering of podiums too. Also 6, as it so happens, and it looked like the Frenchman had really turned a corner after his crash-happy antics of 2012 saw him cop a race ban for causing the incident at the Belgian Grand Prix that nearly took Alonso's head off. 315 points scored in total. That's a lot. I mean, they were a chunk behind Red Bull and they were also a chunk behind Ferrari, but they were well ahead of McLaren who were behind them. But now, the hybrid era was here. The V8s were gone, and Formula 1 entered this new futuristic age, as instead of high-revving 2.4 litre 8-cylinder engines, they were now down to 6 cylinders, with turbos and a battery pack. And they revved nowhere near as high, but the cars would be faster in a straight line at somewhere like Monza. Mercedes, Ferrari and Renault were all looking at how best to attack these new regulations, but there were some aerodynamic rules afoot too. In 2013, cars used these higher style noses that had the stepped platypus design to them that a lot of people cried about at the time because they were ugly. The design, which was first used in 2012 by everybody except McLaren, was in response to new rules that said that the nose had to be a maximum of 55 centimeters or 22 inches at a certain point in front of the front bulkhead. The teams, realising that a higher nose meant for better airflow under the car to the rear diffuser, designed the stepped noses so that the nose's tip was within the regulations, but still able to be as high up as possible. It also came about because a lot of the teams were using their 2011 cars as the basis for the 2012 ones. It was also a safety thing, with crashes like the one that happened to Webber at Valencia and what happened to Lutzi and the Michael at Abu Dhabi. The FIA wanted the noses lower to stop a car being launched up as the nose caught the rear crash structure or a side pod in the event of a T-bone accident. None of that was solved because Spa happened. Something Jonathan Ledgard on the BBC commentary would have called a problem. Literally, everything was a problem. Car slides off? Problem. Engine blows up? Problem. Issues with the gearbox? Problem. Guy has a problem? That's definitely a problem. And now I've said the word problem so many times it no longer sounds like a word. Just a noise. That's definitely a problem. So sticking with the aero changes, the FIA's new design rules would mean that these stepped noses would be out of sorts and would be replaced with a different aesthetic choice by the teams. The new regulations for 2014 meant that the noses would be even lower. The tip of the nose had to be a maximum of 18.5 centimeters or 7.3 inches above the ground, even lower than it had been in 2013. But the teams, knowing that a higher nose was better for shoving air under the car, came up with a solution that resulted in many memes on the internet. Some of the teams, notably Toro Rosso, Marussia, Caterham and Force India, devised a middle finger, figuratively and, well, I guess literally as well. The design was basically have the nose stop at a certain point, and then they'd put a piece of bodywork on the end that served no other purpose than to comply with the regulations. It was one of those, well, you said it has to be this high off the ground, but you never said what shape it had to be. Seriously, that bodywork was just for show, using the minimum amount possible to get away with it. Lotus, meanwhile, tried something completely different with the E22, which sounds like a food preservative. Lotus must have looked at the Williams FW26 from 2004, the Walrus car, and thought that it was something they could base things off. Nick Chester, Chris Cooney, Martin Tolliday, Simon Virrell and John Tomlinson had managed to come up with something that stretched the letter of the rulebook to be within the realms of, look, you're within the rules, but why? The other teams were using the, well, I mean, let's just call it a finger, even though other body parts, particularly of the bloke variety, are often used, while Lotus went with the tusk design that meant that the car was a nightmare for the FIA's crash test boffins. The FIA's regulations meant that the finger design was the only real legal option for dodging the rules, like Toro Rosso and the others had done, so using two equal tusks, like Williams had done back in the day, was illegal. So Lotus designed the two tusks to be of an unequal length, which meant for a design that looked a bit weird, but at the same time was legal. Because what it meant is that by the letter of the law, the longer of the two tusks was the finger used by Toro Rosso and the other teams, and the second of the tusks wasn't considered part of the assembly. It meant that in turn both tusks could function as part of the crash structure, as well as being front wing struts and also turning vanes. Somehow. But that's what Craig Scarborough said, so I'm not going to argue with somebody who knows more about aerodynamics than I do. I just have an audio engineering degree. But it wasn't just Lotus that had considered it. Speaking to Autosport during 2014, James Allison, who was at Ferrari at the time, said that the design was a possible route they could take, and Toro Rosso's James Key had also considered the idea. Meanwhile, Lotus was surprised that no one else had had a crack at the idea and were convinced that it had advantages to the finger noses and whatever Ferrari and Mercedes were running, probably because of the mayhem it was causing with the crash testing. But it appears that the straight line aero advantages weren't great. For directional changes it was pretty good, but it was let down in other places. The central section was more open as it would have been in, say, the mid-90s, which would allow more airflow to the under-tray of the car. But the detail wasn't there, apparently. The car would only score 3 points finishes all season, Grosjean scoring in Spain and Monaco, while Maldonado only scored in Austin. It was a mix of the underpowered Renault engine that was getting a lot of criticism from Red Bull, and also because of a fundamental design flaw with the chassis. There were also persistent rumours of financial issues at Lotus too, which caused a mass exodus of key personnel, including James Allison. So I think it's kind of like the whole Tyrrell thing that we looked at before, where they would have a really good idea, but couldn't really develop it because, well, the funds weren't there. One of the key problems with the car, again, that word problem, was a lack of rear stability, particularly under braking. Helping to compensate with that was the Frick suspension setup that the FIA clamped down on during 2014, which messed a few teams about, including Lotus, because they had one of the more advanced designs on the grid. This is also on top of the Renault hybrid problems that seem, oh my god, I'm saying problem again, that seem to be worse on their car than the Red Bulls, with 2 engine fires curtailing their test time pre-season. They'd already missed out on one of the tests because the car was still being crash tested. By the Spanish Grand Prix though, they had an upturn in fortunes as the new aero package helped, but that was then undone when Frick was banned later on. By the Italian Grand Prix, the E22 had been abandoned for work on the E23, which would have a Mercedes engine and a normal nose. Because the Renault engine had so many issues that the brains and money at Red Bull could easily engineer their way out of, Lotus's plans for the car made the problems with the engines even worse. The packaging of the car was all over the place. What they intended to do was solid, but when they got the engines from Renault, the thing just wouldn't work as it should have done on paper. What Lotus attempted to do was to put all the engine control stuff under the fuel tank, which was a packaging choice shared with Toro Rosso, who also used Renault engines as per the partnership with Red Bull, but the area they were going to be putting those bits and pieces in was going to be too hot for the Renault engine to handle. It didn't help that they were also using a water-to-air intercooler, which also caused the engine to overheat, but yeah, that and the gearbox, because that never seemed to work either. So Lotus trialled a 2015 style nose that had no tuskage at the US Grand Prix, where Maldonado scored his only points of the season and the final points of the team that year. The FIA had made changes to the rulebook to try and reduce the amount of fingers on the grid in response to the negative response to the nose designs. The nose design ran in free practice only, but the tusks were back on for the actual race. They had also announced a switch to Mercedes power to try and get back to the front of the grid, but the money problems were starting to pile up. As it was, Lotus went from finishing 4th in 2013 to 8th in 2014. The 2015 car was a bit better. Grosjean managed to bag a 3rd place at the Belgian Grand Prix after Vettel's tyre blew up near the end, with the team celebrating like it had just won the championship, as the cars were about to be impounded for lack of payments on debts. Crazy stuff. Fundamental flaw with the chassis, bad luck of the draw with the engines, and monetary problems behind the scenes. It all adds up. But having seen how Williams had to ditch the Walrus design for similar aero-related problems that couldn't be overcome with all that BMW money was probably an indication of the E22 not being what the designers thought it could be. But that was 10 years after the Williams. Aero knowledge had improved, the designs and regulations had changed, you now had fluid dynamics software and other advanced things like that. Maybe it could have worked this time round. And maybe it could, with the right brains and budget, but who even knows at this point with so much going on at the team? So then, a look at the meme that was the Lotus E22 with the weird tusks on it. If this has been a fun look back through the history books and explained some stuff you might have had questions about, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from this channel, get subscribed with that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that happens around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon that support this channel at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep things running around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and bobs you might find interesting. You might want to start getting your Max Verstappen gear from the Red Bull section of the F1 store now before he leaves along with Adrian Newey. Keck. Anyway, until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.